Philippians 2, 5 through 8. Let's just go ahead and read them. From the NWT. Keep this mental attitude in you that was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he was existing in God's form, gave no consideration to a seizure, a grabbing hold of something, literally or figuratively. Namely, that he should be equal to God. So the NWT is here saying that the thing that he didn't consider seizing was an equality with God. Verse 7, no, but he emptied himself and took a slave's form and came to be in the likeness of men. Verse 8, last text of our subject text reading, and then we're going to go back and look at it closely. More than that, when he, that is Jesus, found himself in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient as far as death. Yes, death on a torture stake. And then we've already read and reviewed verses 9 through 11. We may come back to it in a moment. But let's focus on verses 5 through 8. All right, so verse 5 basically tells us we should have the same attitude, right? And then verses 6 through 8 describe the attitude we should have. Excuse me. And in the NWT it says that Jesus was existing in God's form, but he didn't consider seizing equality with God while in that form. But instead, he emptied himself and took a slave's form. So he's in this form. He does something to himself. And then he takes a slave's form. So there's this form. Something happens. It's the verb kanao, reference to the personal pronoun Jesus himself. He's doing something which is translated here as emptying himself prior to taking a slave's form and coming to be in the likeness of men. And the Greek word for form in both verse 6 and verse 7 is morphe. God's form, slave's form. And then likeness of men, it's a Greek term, likeness is schema. So you have similar descriptions here, right? Not exactly the same, but similar. He takes on a slave's form. Well, what's a slave's form? Well, we know what the likeness of men is, right? I mean, it's like being like a man. And schema tends to have more of an emphasis on the outward appearance, although morphe can as well. You can look up the definitions of these terms in any standard lexical source. It's really not controversial. Although morphe sometimes is brought up in a controversial way, especially by Trinitarians, because, well, when it comes to what he emptied himself of, remember, as we've discussed, Trinitarians believe Jesus never stopped being God. Never. He's always been God with the Father and the Holy Spirit. And he remained and did not cease to be God when he became a man. Even according to what it says right here. They don't believe that emptying himself means he gave up the morphe theou, the form of God. They don't believe that kanao, the verb for emptying, means he gave up that form. They believe he still has this form, even though he took on this form. And so they view form as you'll see if you look up the definitions in some lexicons and in other just sources that are Trinitarian, they connect it more with the nature of God in this case. And so, while they wouldn't exclude the outward appearance necessarily, they would see that as being cloaked by the flesh. You know what I'm saying? So they would see it similar to John 1:1 in that the Word was with God, right? In the form of God. Would be the same here. And then in John 1:14, the Word became flesh. So they would see that as being the same here. And we do too. But they don't see the difference between this and this, or John 1:1 and John 1:14, which is described by Paul as this. Right? John doesn't really describe the process, just says he became flesh, right? You could talk a little bit about the verb used there, became, genomai, but we'll talk about that when we get to John 1 more. Here, though, it's a little bit more descriptive, I would say, in terms of what it means. Emptying, totally destroying, depriving yourself of something. Trinitarian, even as strong as the verb kanao is in that regard, and you can look it up again in any standard source, it's not controversial, but the way they apply it is more limited. Right? So that they would apply it really almost in the sense of how he covers it up. Right? He limits himself, is how they talk about it. So he's in God's form, according to Trinitarians, which they mean more as like part of, the second person of the Trinity. He has the nature of God. That's kind of how they see Marphe here, even if they would grant some external association. The fact is that they see this as meaning he has the nature of God. He exists with the nature of God. And when they see verse 7 say he emptied himself, they don't see that as him setting that aside. They don't see that as like he's rich, sets aside all his money, no longer has it, and now he's poor. Whether or not they connect that text with this, I'm using it because I believe it fits, which is what Paul says. He was rich, he became poor. This is exactly what it's talking about here, but that's figurative sense. So in any case, they don't see Jesus losing this when he becomes this. They believe that the emptying of himself means he limited himself. He cloaked himself basically in the flesh, and so you don't see the divine nature. Some would say that he released it like at the transfiguration, But that's not what that text says, nor do any of these texts say that. Right? That's just how they would cite that probably as an example of what they're talking about. The text doesn't teach that's what it is, but they believe that's what it is. All right? If other texts taught explicitly, right, that Jesus had the Marphe Theou with the Marphe Doulos, or the likeness of men, schema, well, then that'd be different. Then we could all say, okay, that's probably transfiguration, him unveiling the Marphe Theou he still has. He's just cloaking. He's not letting us see it, right? But that's not the case. It's just God releasing his power in that way. And what does John 14 say? The Father's the one doing these things through him, right? So, in any case, let's get back to what the text says. We can always go to these complementing verses and things, but what does the text really say, right? Well, before we go to the Bible Hub and look at the Trinitarian translations, it says he was in the form of God. We'll talk about this part in a moment. We're talking right now about these sequences. Pre-human existence, human existence. We talked about this, pretty extensively on the Hebrews 1 discussion and Hebrews 2. Right? What in Hebrews 1 makes you think of what when you read this, he was existing in God's form? What in Hebrews 1 do you think of, if anything, as parallel to that? Right? I brought up John 1:1 because It's just obvious, right? He's in the beginning with God, and then it goes on to describe him taking on flesh. Pretty much just like here. So what in Hebrews 1, can you recall, is like this? Right? This is a little more expressive than John 1, right? It just calls him theos there. Here it says he's in the marphetheu, form of a god or God. It's theu without the article. And so he's either in the form of a god like one of the sons of God who are gods, right? Spirits. Or he's in God's form in some way. What way could he be in God's form that you can think of? Specifically, Hebrews 1. The character, right? Ha ha! Isn't this pretty much saying the same thing? If it's not saying he's in the form of a god like the sons of God have the form of God, being sons of God, spirits made in his image. If it's not saying that, if it's not specifying him individually as having a form, a spirit form like a god, and contrasting that with a form that he takes on like a man, which is very possible. No reason it couldn't be. Be fit and consistent with John 1 and with John 10. But how could he be existing in God's form if we left it like the NWT translates it? What in Hebrews 1 would fit that concept? Character, like I said, right? So if he's the exact imprint of God's being, like Hebrews 1 says, when you're an imprint of something, according to the term used, character, right? Character tes hypostaseos. In the meaning of the term character, it's like the imprint of a seal ring into wax, so that you seal a letter and they know it comes from you because you have the ring. You have the original, and the seal that you imprint in the wax is the copy. That's the imprint, the character. Well, the character is obviously not the same age as the ring, right? You can't make the seal in the wax before you make the ring, or you have the ring, right? We're talking about physical examples, so they both have a beginning. But you know what I'm saying? The ring comes before the seal in the wax. It's not possible to have a seal in the wax before you have the ring that makes the seal, unless it's some other kind of seal, right? Okay. So we know that the use of the term character makes it clear that when it relates to God's hypostasis, his spirit being, Jesus is a copy of that. He's the imprint, like the wax. Different in terms of time, right? The ring makes the seal in the wax. But when you look at the seal in the wax, isn't the whole point that you recognize it has the exact imprint of the ring? It is the seal of God. Jesus is imprinted as the seal of God. So he has that exact imprint. That doesn't mean he has the same substance. That's the whole point of character, right? That's the whole point of Hebrews 1 saying, when it's talking about the Son, in the state in which he holds all things by the word of his power, being the imprint of God's being, the outshining of his glory. That he has that exact identifying mark, but is different. So in that sense, that is in addition to him being in the form of a God like the sons of God are gods, he could be in the form of God by having the exact imprint of God's being. So there is absolutely a sense in which translating it capital G-O-D here is consistent with Jesus as a son of God being the imprint of his being. Doesn't make him God. In fact, by being in the form of a God or form of God, it implies, like Hebrews 1 makes explicit, that they're separate. And in fact, the rest of Philippians 2, according to the NWT, states he gave no consideration to a seizure, namely he should be equal to God. Okay, so set aside for a moment whether or not that's the correct translation. It again brings up God. This last part of verse 6. Separate from Jesus, who's existing in God's form. Right? What would be the point of bringing up him considering being equal to God, if being in God's form already meant that? You see? This would make no sense to bring up in addition to this, if this alone was evidence of this. But it's like he's in this, and in that there's thought, given or not given, to seizing or holding on to equality with God. The decision that Paul goes on to describe is one where, regardless of this, we'll come back to it in a moment, he does something to himself, kanao, which if you look up and see, you'll see means to totally deplete or destroy, remove something. There's nothing left. So he totally removed whatever he was, which is this, and then became this. All right, so we're in the NWT. Is that what it really means, and is that what it can be shown to mean according to other texts? Let's take a look. This is the Bible Hub. It's just a convenient online internet resource that allows you to type in and get multiple translations of text and other resources as well. So let's take a look. We know Philippians 2:5 is talking about the mindset we should have like Jesus Christ. We read that in NWT. And then here we get in the New International Version. This way we can see both, right? Who being in very nature God. Remember I told you, Trinitarians see form of God as nature of God. Because they know as a man, he doesn't have the outside appearance of God, except for, like I mentioned, a transfiguration type event. But they still believe he's God. Never stopped being God. You just can't see it when he's a man. So he's got that nature. He has two natures when he's on earth, according to Trinitarians. He's not setting aside his divine form or nature, or stopping being theos, right? Which is why John 10 and John 1 link up so well, right? Because you can show in both cases, with respect to theos, the context shows what he's talking about. And in Trinitarians' case, they believe in both cases it's applying to his divine nature, even as a man, because he has two natures, according to their view. So they don't see Philippians 2:6 as him, or I should say 7, giving up that form of God in 2:6 and then taking on this form of a man. That's why New International Version, right here, who being in very nature God did not consider equality as something with God, something to be used to his own advantage. So here in the New International Version, you can see, as opposed to the NWT, that rather than Jesus being in God's form and not considering equality with God as something to grab onto or seize, New International Version believes who in very nature God didn't consider the equality he has with God, right? Equality with God, something to use to his own advantage. So New International Version is saying he already has this equality with God, while in very nature God. And even though he has this equality, he's not using it for his own advantage. All right, now let's take a look at a few others. New Living Translation, though he was God. right? They don't even bring up form or nature, right? It's like it was just theos used here. He did not think of equality, again, accepting equality as something he has, not something he's considering or didn't consider taking, like in NWT. Do not consider equality with God as something to cling to, right? So he already has the equality according to the New Living Translation, but he doesn't hold on to it. Though he was God, he didn't hold on to this equality with God. You see the kind of weird sense in which the second use of God, the equality with God I highlighted when I showed NWT up there at the top, second part of verse 6, or the last part, that he should be equal to God shows a difference between him as in the form of God and the God that he's considering or not considering being equal with. Look at the New Living Translation. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God. It's kind of like John 1:1, right? Where they have the word was God, being with God. Here it just says he has equality with God. But that's a separate God it's talking about, or at least the Father in one Trinitarian sense or another, right? Or maybe even here as the Trinity itself, right? He was in the very nature God. So Trinitarians might see this as a use, at least in the last part of Philippians 2, where it says equal to God, as like equal to the Godhead, the divine nature that the persons share. So they would probably see that as him not considering his equality as God with the nature of God, right? Having the nature of God, that equality with the other persons of the triune God, sharing that same nature, right? Equal. He didn't consider that equality as something to hold on to, but he gave it up as part of the Trinity. But he still think about it. What did he give up then? See, in their mind, it's a limiting. He just drew it in under the flesh, basically. Still has it. Still has all the divine qualities and nature of God, fully, 100%. He's just also a man, right? Which contradicts what? Hebrews 2, and quoting Psalm 8, which says he was made lower than gods or angels. It's a direct conflict with those texts. And with the text we're reading this evening in Philippians 2, which talk about him emptying himself, kanao. It doesn't mean to limit. I'm not aware of any text that uses kanao that means you're limiting what you have. The examples that I'm familiar with and looked up show that it's totally gone. You don't have anything to use. And that's what the implication is, at least here, and I'm going to argue according to the use of the verb kanao, that he gave up what's being discussed, God's form, the form of God or a God. And then it goes on to describe him taking on the very same thing he had, but as a man. So Philippians 2 goes through a transition, very similar to Hebrews 1 and 2, does it not? Where he's the one through whom God made the ages, the imprint of God's being, the outshine of his glory, but then he makes a purification. He's resurrected, sits at God's right hand. Here in Philippians 2, it does basically the same thing, right? It doesn't get into creation, but it says he was in God's form, or in the form of a God. And then it says he emptied himself. So something happened to that. That's what it's talking about. Trinitarians are really misleading people by claiming kanao in verse 7 means he just limited the form of God. It doesn't say that. Kanao doesn't mean to limit. And even if there's some obscure text out there that you can find that might mean that in some way, it overwhelmingly means, in most cases, empty, totally depleted, gone. What's under discussion? Form of God. Marphetheu. What does it say he took on? Marphedulu. The schema of man. So it's very clear, just on its face, without any translation issues, which we'll get to in a moment with regard to the second part of verse 6. That aside, it's very clear, is it not? He's in the form of a God or God. Either as one of the sons of God or as the imprint of God's being. And then he empties himself, kanao. Well, the only thing being talked about is the form of God. So that has to be what he's emptying. That's who he is. It says he emptied himself. Which is in verse 7. And it uses the pronoun eautu, of himself. It says he emptied himself. Well, what did he have? The form of God. The form of a God. There's nothing else being discussed. That's him. That's himself. There is no other self before the rest of verse 7. Verse 6 is himself, that he was in heaven, in the form of God, imprint of his being, or as a son of God, spirit being. He emptied himself. That's himself, the marphe theou. There is no other self. Don't forget that, because Trinitarians do. And they try to argue that he didn't empty himself of the marphe theou, right? Because that would be what? According to the NIV, the very nature of God. He can't give that up. Not because the text says he can't give it up. The text say he did, right? We know that. It's explicit. Hebrews 2, probably the most obvious. It quotes the text that makes that so obvious because it's talking about us in relation to angels as gods, whom the Son of God was, according to him in John 10, and the text he uses to defend himself against the Jews' accusation against him. He's the one who says he was like them in that way. So if he gave up being that way, why do Trinitarians believe he still is God while a man? It's not because of the text, as I was saying. The text makes it explicit. Hebrews 2, Philippians 2. He became lower than the angels. He gave up the form of God, of a God, being the imprint of God's being, being the Son of God in heaven. He gave that up and took on what is described for us probably best in what? Isaiah 53. He took on the form, marphe, of a slave, doulos. The likeness of a man. Right? He didn't become human, take on flesh as a man, and have the outward appearance and nature dispositionally of, say, a real king. Right? Prophetically, of course he's a king. But he wasn't appearing and manifesting as a king. Does Isaiah 53 describe someone who is viewed outwardly and dispositionally by others as a king? Why does it say a slave's form then, right here? And I think you'll find that if you read in Isaiah 53, that's a slave's form, not a king. So he emptied himself of the form of God. It doesn't mean to limit. Like Raul points out rightly, they will say that. It doesn't mean that. They can say anything. Is the text telling us that? Does the text say he limited himself? Not according to the uses of kanao, you'll find. What tells him that then? Does Hebrews 2 say he limited himself? That he was just more limited than the angels? Or did he become lower than the angels? So he didn't have the same abilities that even the angels have as gods. And what is it talking about right here in terms of either limiting or emptying? Him being a God in the form of God. The very form or type of being he's said to have been made lower than. So how could he be limited in the sense that he's still better than the very ones he's explicitly said to have been made lower than? It's a conflict, right? It's the whole point of this series. What's telling them this? What's informing the Trinitarians and making them see kanao as limited so that he can still have the nature of God while having the nature of man, which are two different natures, right? Which is why Paul says he has to empty one before he takes on the other. But what would be the point? Why not just say what John says? Word became flesh. And I'm going to argue that still implies it became something different. We'll get to it. But this is even more explicit, right? Talking about him emptying himself, kanao. That does not mean limit. It's gone. Whatever you had, look it up. These are not really disputable terms. Oh, they'll dispute them, I know. But that's why you look it up. That's why you show, right? Well, I can't do that with every term, right? I'm not going to use the whole show to go through every use of marphe and kanao, but we are going to read some more material in a moment. My point is, this stuff is not that complicated. It's pretty clear, other than the part we haven't really focused on yet, right? Gave no consideration to a seizure, namely, he should be equal to God, NWT. Let's look at the Bible Hub text a little bit more. So NIV says, he did not consider equality he had with God. I had a habit. That's what it means, right? Equality with God, something to be used. Let's take a look. New American Standard, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality, right? So he has it according to this translation. Whereas the NWT, as you can see from above, he didn't consider seizing equality with God. What's the difference? Which is correct. Although he existed in the form of God, he didn't regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Oh, so actually, this might be more consistent. It depends on how you see the translation here. It could probably go either way. Didn't regard equality with God as a thing to be grasped. So depending on whether or not that means something to be held on to or something to reach out and grab, it could be more consistent with NWT. New King James, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. So I would see that as meaning that he didn't consider it an act of robbery to be equal with God, right? It was something he had. He was in the form of God, so he didn't consider it robbery because he already had it. King James, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Okay, so which is it? Did he not consider seizing equality with God, and that's how he emptied himself by taking on the form of a man instead of seizing out to grab onto equality with the Father? Or did he already have equality with God, being the imprint of his being and having that exact imprint likeness? Or as the Son of God being a spirit being like God? Did he already have an equality with God? Or did he, in God's form or in the form of God, not consider seizing equality in some other way, but instead became a man? Well, let me share with you probably, it is my most recent writing on this subject. I have discussed this issue elsewhere, both in my 3 dissertations, as you'll see referenced in the note below, and in an online writing called Upon the Lampstand, which is on my Elihu Books site, where I have several papers. I haven't added to these papers in a while, but they're still usable and fairly recent. And one of them answers a question related to the NWT and the NASB, like we just reviewed, and it goes into detail to discuss the difference. I'll put a link to this article in the description below. But if you have JWD3, either the printed or the digital edition, go ahead and go to page 214. And let's take a look at this issue a little more closely. Specifically, although we will cover again this idea of marphe theou, form of God, what it means to be in that form, what it means to give it up, right? Kanao. But we're going to talk more now about this idea of being equal with God. What that means, could mean, and which translation is correct. The NWT, which talks about him giving no consideration to seizing equality with God, or other texts, like KJV, which regarded as something he didn't think of robbing God of, because he already had it. Most explicitly, of course, was the NIV. Let's take a look. So starting on page 214, pretty much right after this paragraph here, I give my translation of Philippians 2, 5 through 9. And it's actually, I believe, 5 through 8. But in any case, let's go ahead and read it. Your attitude should be the same as Jesus Christ's. This is my translation according to the best available reasons I have, or had, at least at this time, in around 2012, when I updated JWD3 for the digital version. This is how I translate the text we're talking about. Your attitude should be the same as Jesus Christ, who, even though he was existing in the form of God or a divine form, he did not consider this equality with or likeness to God as something to exploit. That sounds a little similar, doesn't it, to NIV? Not this part, but this part. He did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. So do I agree with NIV here? And if so, why? Let's go back to what I had to say right after my translation, or I think we need to finish up a little bit of it. So, instead he gave himself up, took on the appearance of a slave, and he came to be the same as men. When he found out he was in the same form as men, he lowered himself even further by becoming obedient until death. Indeed, death by torture state. You notice this lowering further, right? The lowering further is when he actually gave himself in death. But he was already lowered, like we are, than the angels, or the gods who are angels in Psalm 8, according to Hebrews 2, by becoming a man. Just like it says right here. He just went even further with it, right? That was something in itself, right? Giving up the form of a god or God, which is what kanao means. That's a big step. Giving that up and taking on a lower nature. But then even going further than that, right? Not just becoming a man and then being caught away like Enoch maybe. He actually goes through this painful process put upon him by the wicked one. So then I say, if what I propose above is correct, then in giving up his equality or likeness with God, Jesus showed the highest level of humility and obedience, indeed worship, that is possible for one to demonstrate. We'll get to the notes in a moment. These notes are very significant, especially for our discussion. It is, in fact, this very humility and obedience that Paul gives Paul reason to bring up Jesus' pre-human activities in the first place. While grammatically, I do not believe NWT's rendering has the best reasons supporting it, it is not without any good reasons, but the best available reasons, including the syntactical idiom described in the notes that I'm scrolling through and we're going to review in a moment, support the view that Paul refers here to Jesus in his pre-human state in the form of a god or God, marphe theou. It is this form that Jesus chose to give up, emptied himself, kanao. So he set aside this equality or likeness. Isa. You see the note there next to it. We'll go to it in a moment. He set aside, according to my view and translation, the equality he had with God in terms of his form. And by equality, Isa doesn't always mean like exact. It means also likeness, as I'll show in a moment. Just like in Hebrews 1, when it says, regarding the Son, he's the imprint of God's being. Right? That's in one sense exact, because of the outline of the image, right? But it's not really the exact same thing. It's like it. It's the exact same outline in another thing. So likeness, equality, you have to consider that, and how there's a fine line between the two, and neither one necessarily means exactly the same thing. Jesus can be equal to God in form in terms of him being the outline of the imprint, which is what Paul says. So they're basically saying the same thing, only in different ways, and differentiating Jesus and God as God, just like John does. So then I go on to say, he set aside this equality with God by taking on the slave's form, that is, by becoming to be in the likeness of men. As Hawthorne, an author that I cite elsewhere in these writings, states, this means then that being equal with God is precisely another way of saying in the form of God. Or better still, whatever meaning one might put forth as a possible meaning for the expression in the form of God can only properly be understood in terms of equal to or like God. In other words, he's pointing out what I'm saying, that the equality is specific to the marphe theou. That's what it's talking about. That's why NIV wants to use nature there, but marphe really means the form, the outside form, and which is obviously reflective of the nature, right? You can't have the form without the nature. So it's not exclusive of the nature. It's just that NIV, being a Trinitarian Bible, basically, is going to allow people to think in terms of the Trinity that it's the equality that they have as persons of God. When really, if you just look at it in comparison with other texts that are saying the same thing, like Hebrews 1, the equality is more likely what they're actually talking about elsewhere, that he has the same form, the same imprint, the same outline. Not that he's equal as a person of God within a Godhead. That's not articulated elsewhere like the imprint texts are. You see? We're interpreting form of God using other New Testament texts that are talking about the same time frame, Jesus before he became a man, and what that means. Well, we have other texts. We have Colossians 1, we have Hebrews 1, that say he's the image of the invisible God, that he's the outshining of his hypostases, and the outshining of his glory, the character of his hypostases, And then we have Philippians 2 saying he's in the form of God. And according to the way I see it, and other texts see it, even though we see nature differently, right? I don't see it in a Trinitarian sense. I still see it as Jesus being equal with God in form and nature because he's spirit like God, right? So now let's talk a little bit more about being equal, right? And so he talks about, he goes further, he says, in the form of God can only properly be understood in terms of being equal with God and vice versa. Okay, so then I've explained how marphe really involves the outside form and not to the exclusion of the interior nature. And I have a note at the bottom here, note 11, which states marphe can mean simply appearance without implying that the appearance reflects the actual nature of a person or thing. And then I cite Mark 16:12, the longer ending, where marphe does not reflect a person's underlying nature, since there Jesus had already been raised to life as a spirit being. But he's appearing in a human form, you see? So it's not reflective of his inner nature there. It's his outward appearance there. But then we have other texts where marphe is used. So I discuss it relative to different texts right? For example, you have angels in the Old Testament that take on the form of a man. They can actually have the nature of a man and eat. But they're not actually fully human like Jesus became when he came to the earth. So there's this, it's not quite exact in terms of the connection between the outside form and the underlying nature in terms of Marphe. But I do discuss it further there and give the example of Mark 16:12, where it doesn't appear at all to reflect the underlying nature and only the outside form. Now, if we look at this term Isa, it's this note down here, and I'll try to bring it up a little bit bigger, but you should be able to read it. And if you have my text, I don't want to get it too big, so it's off the screen. But it says the Greek word Isa, used in Philippians 2, the text, part of the text we're reading, can mean either equality or likeness. And then I cite all of these texts that you can look up and see, where the Greek word Isa, just like in Luke 20:36, is used not in terms of exact equality, like in every respect, but in the sense of likeness. Where in that text that I reference in Luke 20:36, it uses Isa to mean that those who die and are resurrected are like angels because they don't marry or are given in marriage, and because they can neither die anymore, right? So they're like the angels, but the angels aren't like that. It doesn't say those who are resurrected become like the angels in every respect and are equal in terms of like a messenger role. They're equal in these specific respects that Luke 20:36 talks about, that they neither marry nor are given in marriage, right? And so, just like in Philippians 2, the specific use of Isa is about the form Jesus had. And I see that as very much similar, if not the same, as in Hebrews 1, where he's the character of God's being. It's exact, but in a different form, in a different substance, right? Separate spirit. Trinitarians don't believe that, but they don't have the biblical text to support their view. We do. Right? So you have all these texts you can use to show that Isa doesn't always mean equal in the exact sense in which Trinitarians want it to mean in Philippians 2:6. Excuse me. So now let's take a look at this issue of the translation in terms of whether it should be translated, gave no consideration to a seizure, namely he should be equal to God, or as we read from the Bible Hub, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Let's take a look at this note here from my JWD Defended, Jehovah's Witnesses Defended JWD. It starts on page 215. I'm going to read this note. We're going to go back to the texts, summarize what we've learned and discussed about them, how it conflicts with the Trinity, and then we're going to wrap it up. So pay attention, because this is the most technical part of this video. And I wanted to save it for near the end because there was no sense in getting to it too early when we had other things we could get to and explain more easily. And then you have the additional references like my Upon the Lampstand article, my writing in JWD 3, and my discussion in 3 dissertations on Philippians 2, if you want more information. All right, but let's take a look at this note. This is a long note, but I didn't want to add it to the main text because it would have really expanded my discussion in this chapter beyond what it already was. Right? I've tried to be comprehensive, so I needed to add a Philippians 2 discussion to make my chapter on Jesus as the Christ from heaven complete. And the best way for me to do it was to put a lot of it in notes, some of it in the main text. But because I'd already discussed a lot of other issues extensively, I was able to get this grammatical point in this note. And if you haven't reviewed it, this is the note that's going to give you the information, along with the information in 3 dissertations and my Upon the Lampstand article, that will give you the information to explain my translation and why I don't think NWT's translation is the best. Now, I know that Rolf Feruli has written in defense of the New World Translation's rendering of Philippians 2. And I discuss why I disagree with Rolf Feruli, starting in note 8, the bottom of the same page, 215, and then going all the way in through. It's another long note, but I didn't want to, again, busy up the main text more than I needed to already. But I go into it in pretty good detail. So I'd encourage you to review that note. I also discuss Jason Badun's writing on this subject, and I disagree with both of them, and I explain why right here. So if you want to know more about why, just review that note. All right, now let's go back to note 7 and review together the most technical information so that I can help explain as necessary why my translation and translations like NIV differ from NWT, and why I don't agree with NIV, of course, in terms of what they mean by nature of God, in very nature God. I don't disagree with their translation of the second part of verse 6. So let's get into it. The syntactical question, the word order, the grammar of Philippians 2 hinges on whether we have an idiomatic, like a way of speaking common to those who spoke Greek, that to us who don't natively seems a little odd, but to them made perfect sense because it was a way of speaking. The question of Philippians 2 hinges, I believe, on whether we have an idiomatic usage of a particular verb, like a way of using it, something common to their speech. Whether we have an idiomatic use of hegeomai, which in this instance means to think or consider, right? Like NWT gave no consideration. That's the verb hegeomai. By idiomatic, I mean a usage that conforms to what we find elsewhere regarding less disputed instances. A way of speaking, right? What we find elsewhere in Greek. Regarding hegeomai with what's called a double accusative. Okay, so what that means, so I can bring that up and give you the terms here. It means that when you have the verb hegeomai, it's not just directed towards one direct object in the accusative. So accusative is a case in Greek that can mark the direct object of a verb. So what is being or not being considered? What's the object of that consideration? Well, being equal with God, right? He either did or didn't consider being equal with God as something to grasp or cling to. The being equal with God, those words in Greek are in the accusative. It's ta enai isa theo. So it's known as an accusative expression that is the direct object of hegeomai. Or I should say that's actually the predicate description, with the direct object in this case being another term. So before I introduce that term, which maybe I should have already, let's go on with what I described here. So there's a double accusative, right? One of those accusatives is the being equal with God. And the accusative case typically marks the direct object of the verb. The being equal with God part is actually not the direct object in this case, but it describes the direct object. Depending on how you see it, I guess you could see it as either way, right? Depending on which expression you want to take as either the predicate or direct object of hegeomai. But in terms of our discussion, hegeomai, the verb for consider here, has a double accusative construction, with one expression being the accusative description of the direct object. Okay? That's what's meant by double accusative. Hegeomai has one accusative as a direct object, and then there's a description of that direct object that's also in the accusative. It's called a predicate accusative, right? A predicate describes something. So in this instance, hegeomai has a direct object, like most verbs, right? Unless it's a copula verb. And the direct object has a description. All right, so with that in mind, that explains double accusative and hegeomai. That's what that means. To consider something. There's your first accusative. And that something that you're considering is further described. There's your second accusative. One's an accusative direct object. The other is an accusative description or predicate. All right, I wanted to stop for a minute and break that down, especially since initially in going over it, as the accusative being the direct object typically for a Greek verb, but then the being equal with God isn't the accusative object, at least not how I'm going to describe it in a moment. But let me go on reading now that you understand, hopefully, and I'll go over it again, what is meant by double accusative. The verb hegeomai has two accusatives. One is the object, one is a description of the object. The question here has to do with the meaning of hegeomai, where one articulated, right, with the article. That's what that means. Anartharous means without the Greek article. And artharous or articulated means with the article. So like in John 1:1, the first use of theos would be articulated or artharous. And the second use of theos for the word is considered anartharous, without the article. In this case, one of the accusatives, in this case specifically, the one following hegeomai, which is the being equal with God, what I quoted earlier, ta enai, isateo, that accusative expression that follows hegeomai in the Greek text has the article, right? Ta. Ta enai, isateo, the being equal with God. That accusative follows hegeomai. And then there's another accusative, right, the double accusative, that doesn't have the article, or is anartharous. And that accusative precedes hegeomai. And in the Greek text, it's kind of small, harpagmon. Harpagmon hegesata tai enai isateo. So you have harpagmon, which is the word in the NWT translated a seizure. He did not consider a seizure, namely to be equal with God. So NWT sees harpagmon really as the direct object. He didn't consider a seizure, namely to further explain or describe the seizure, that he should be equal to God, the thing he's seizing. That's how NWT's translation basically stacks up with the Greek. In my translation, let's go to that for a moment, did not consider this equality as something to exploit. I see it differently than NWT. So whereas NWT sees, again, the seizure, harpagmon, as the direct object, he didn't consider a seizure, namely he should be equal to God. That's the predicate, the second accusative, the predicate accusative describing harpagmon. I see ta enai isateo, like I was saying originally before, but I was getting ready to talk about the NWT, so that's what I meant when I had to change kind of what I was talking about and how it wouldn't be the direct object when I was about to discuss the NWT. after explaining what I meant there and why there's two accusatives and how you could consider either one really as the direct object and the other as the description of it. So NWT considers harpagmon as the direct object of hegemai, consider, and being equal with God is the description of harpagmon, the thing that he, in their view, didn't consider seizing. Didn't consider seizing an equality with God. He didn't consider a seizure, right? It's not seizing as a verb. It's harpagmon, a noun. It's related to the verb harpazo, but it's a noun. He didn't consider a seizure. That's why robbery, he thought it not a robbery or robbery. There's a verbal idea, of course, but it's really an object. He didn't consider this as either something he had or something to grasp. Right? I translate it as he didn't consider this equality. That's the direct object, the being equal with God. He didn't consider that direct object, being equal with God, as the description or predicate, something to exploit, harpagmon. So let's go back to the note. NWT sees it in one sense, hegemai, with the object as being harpagmon, further described by the being equal with God, whereas I see it as hegemai with the direct object being equal with God, further described by harpagmon. And I believe the same thing is true with the NIV. He did not consider equality, right? That's the direct object. Something to be used to his own advantage. There's the description. English Standard Version, he didn't count equality with God a thing, right? Harpagmon, again, a noun, to be grasped. That's what they're getting at when they write a thing to be grasped. But again, you have the direct object accusative of hegemai. He didn't count hegemai, equality with God, ta ena isateo, a thing to be grasped, harpagmon. So, which is it, right? Is it just so open that it could be either one? That the direct object of hegemai could be the being equal with God, and the predicate of being equal with God, harpagmon? Or the direct object of hegemai could be harpagmon, further described by the being equal with God? Let's go back to the note, because there is a pattern, a usage, an idiom that helps us narrow this down so that we can better decide which one, which is what I use as the basis for my translation. And that is where we have a double accusative construction with hegemai, like we've been talking about. Remember, this is the most technical part. Whenever we have a construction like we've been talking about, hegemai, a verb, with a double accusative construction, one is an object, one is a predicate description of the object. Whenever we have that with hegemai, it appears the accusative which follows hegemai always serves as the direct object. That would make the being equal with God the direct object, like in my translation and in those we reviewed on Bible Hub, but not like in the NWT. That doesn't mean NWT is just totally wrong, right? Because, again, you're dealing with a double accusative construction. And as a translator, you have to make a decision on which accusative it is when you're considering its usage, the double accusative construction with hegemai. But there's a pattern of usage often that comes up, most often when we discuss things like Sharp's rule and others, but there's other patterns of usage that can help you narrow down idioms and ways of speech that are more common and likely correct than others. And so that's the case here with hegemai in a double accusative construction. So it appears that when that's the case, when you have what we have in Philippians 2:6, that the direct object is always the accusative that follows hegemai, not the one preceding it, like harpagmon, a thing to be grasped or clung to. Predicate accusatives describe direct objects, right? So depending on which one you take as the direct object, in Philippians 2. The other one is describing it. So he's either considering a seizure, namely, he should be equal to God, or he's considering his equality with God something or something not to seize or grab onto, hold to, retain. Then I cite Roy Hoover's article in the Harvard Theological Review, who first proposed just such a view like we're talking about, where you have the double accusative construction with hegemai, the accusative following hegemai, in this case the being equal with God, is the direct object, and the accusative preceding hegemai is the predicate accusative describing the direct object. For example, as given in the article by Roy Hoover, in Isidore of Pelusium, 4th century CE, we read, E hermaion hegesata tai enai isan, if he considered being equal a treasure. Right? So here you have the verb hegesata, which is a form of the verb hegeomai, just like in Philippians 2. And just like in Philippians 2, you have following hegeomai an articulated accusative object. So it shows the pattern of an articulated accusative object following hegeomai. And then you have, as I go on to explain, the anarthrous or unarticulated accusative predicate preceding hegeomai. It's exactly like in Philippians 2. Only in Philippians 2 you have harpagmon, and you have here after hegemai, ta enai isateo. But it's otherwise exactly. Yet the translation really is only appropriate if the accusative following hegemai is the object, and the accusative preceding hegemai, the predicate accusative. Another example. Diodorus Siculus, whom we reference often when it has to do with the divine name, right? In his library, 1543. On arriving in Egypt, he met the king and urged him to continue the war energetically and to consider the war against the Persians a common undertaking. Koinon hegestai tan pros tus persas palemon. Here again, look. Hegeomai, right there, form of hegeomai. Following hegeomai, you have the articulated with the article accusative as the direct object. He considered the war against the Persians as something. So like in Philippians 2, he considered equality with God as something. Consider or didn't consider, right? Negative or positive. Either way, my point is that in the syntactical components, it's the same, right? So hegemai, in this instance, in Diodorus Siculus, shows that the direct object, the war against the Persians, that's your object of hegemai. You didn't consider the war against the Persians as a common undertaking. It wasn't a common undertaking. The war against the Persians wasn't considered a common undertaking. The equality with God he did or didn't have, he considered it or didn't consider it a seizure or something to cling to. You understand how I'm going? So the NWT wouldn't be consistent in terms of the syntactical pattern of hegemai with the articulated accusative following it being the direct object, because they view in the translation harpagmon, the unarticulated, without the article, accusative preceding hegemai in Philippians 2, as the direct object in their translation. He gave no consideration to a seizure. I want to make sure I didn't turn the sound off. Namely, that he should be equal to God. He considered the war against the Persians. He gave no consideration to a seizure. See? Hegemai, consider, and the direct object, war against the Persians. to a seizure. They're being viewed as the direct object in both instances. Whereas in my case, with Philippians 2 and other texts like the NIV, the direct object is being equal with God, or not being equal with God, which is then further described by harpagmon. Let's go further with the note before we get to that. So, one more. In Josephus, War of the Jews, he writes, to consider the harm of your friends as your own. Here, the anarthrous, predicate accusative, without the article, accusative case term. The anarthrous, predicate accusative, oikeon, one's own, precedes hageomai. And hageomai is again followed, in this reference by Josephus, by an articulated with the article, accusative object, tein blaben, the harm. Consider the harm of your friends as your own. There's your predicate accusative. Consider, hageomai, the harm of your friends. There's your direct object. As your own. Predicate accusative. So it really is the same syntactically as Philippians 2. All of these examples that I describe here are. Therefore, it seems likely that the anarthrous, accusative, hageomai, articular, accusative construction always conforms to the previously described usage. Predicate accusative, hageomai, direct object accusative. All right. So that kind of discusses or deals with the whole translation of verse 6 in terms of this part. Right? So here's hageomai. Gave no consideration to a seizure. In the negative, right? He did not consider hageomai. What? What's the direct object of him not considering? In NWT, it's harpagmon, a seizure. He did not consider a seizure. Namely, it's more explanatory here, right? That he should be equal to God. Right? That's your explanation, your description, the predicate accusative for a seizure in the NWT's translation. But the pattern we just reviewed of non-article accusative, hageomai, the verb, followed by article accusative, is that the article accusative that follows hageomai should be the direct object in translation. He did not consider the being equal with God as harpagmon. Something to grab, something to seize, something to exploit, something to cling to, take advantage, right? Like the NIV stated. And then in my translation, didn't consider it as something to exploit, right? Did not consider, there's hageomai, this equality or likeness, right? We talked about Isa. Doesn't always mean exact equal in the way Trinitarians see it. He didn't consider that equality with God he had by being in the form of God, right? Whether as the imprint of God's being, equal in terms of the outline from the ring and the wax. Same thing, only different. They could be equal like that, or like each other like that. Or in the sense in which he's the Son of God as a spirit, being like God. God is a spirit. Jesus raises a spirit. Spirit with God. It's a likeness. It's an equality. Just like the equality or likeness that people who are raised have with angels in Luke 20:36. It doesn't make them equal in every respect to angels. It just means they're like them in those respects that are under discussion. Just like in Philippians 2. The equality he had with God in terms of having the same form or nature. Because really, they're both the same in terms of spirit and form. I'm not saying every spirit form is the same, but in terms of being by nature the same. What does it say about men? He became like men, right? So we're all the same in one sense. That's why it says that. But we're different individually. But we're all the same as men. So in another sense, they're all the same as spirits. Right? It's the same thing. It's the same parallel being made. Took on the form of slave. Came in the likeness of men. He was in the form of God, imprint of God's being. But he didn't consider, in my view, based on the translation information we just reviewed and that I talk about in my writings, he didn't consider the equality of form that he had with God as a spirit, as God, with God. The imprint of his being, the outshine of his glory. That's what I mean. I could go on and describe and discuss further in these writings. That's the equality or likeness I believe is being taught. He didn't exploit or use to his own advantage, right? He didn't even cling to it in the sense that he refused to give it up to do what had to be done. To become lower than the angels. To give up that equality or likeness with God he had as a spirit, as the imprint of God's being. He didn't try to exploit that and then maybe coerce another spirit being to do it, right? He's too good. He's more like God than you, and so you go, right? You're lower. He went all the way. Not just by being lower than the angels, but even dying as one who's lower than the angels. And then God raising him up to be even better than the angels. On his throne, doing what no one else had done as his own son. So when you consider it in that way, and you look at these other translations from the Bible Hub, right, we know the Trinity is going to be informing a lot of what they're talking about. Right? So when they talk about being in the form of God, thought it not a thing to be grasped, to be equal with God, it's a little more difficult to discuss, of course, there. But if we just go back to the NIV, for example, you can see who being in very nature God. That's more Trinitarian sounding, right? But even we understand what God's nature is. It's spirit, John 4:24. So when we hear nature of God, we understand that to be spirit, right? Or imprint of his being as a separate spirit. They don't. They understand that as he's sharing the nature of God with the Father and the Holy Spirit equally, right? So you have to have that understanding if you're going to deal with and use texts like the NIV, and you're going to say, well, yeah, I believe he's in nature God. And they're going to be like, well, wait a minute. How can you believe that? See, because they're thinking Trinity. You're thinking, well, spirit. He's spirit like God. So there's always going to be that with people that use these types of translations, even if the words themselves don't quite mean what they're talking about. They never do. They import that into it. But some translations, especially in texts like the NIV, are more close to it, right? They're more Trinitarian in the way they come out. And then, of course, it makes it plain that he didn't consider his equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. All right, so with the NIV, the real difference between NIV and my translation, in terms of meaning, is they believe he had an equality with God in very nature God, which if you ask them, they're going to talk about it almost assuredly in a Trinitarian sense. But that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what the text requires us to talk about. That's not what the hegeomai with the double accusative requires. It's just that the syntactical pattern with hegeomai and a double accusative, if you look at it idiomatically as a way they talked, then it's more likely that the direct object is being equal with God with harpagmon as the description, and either the thing he didn't grasp at or the thing he didn't exploit by having already, right? Who, though he didn't consider the equality with God as something to grasp, it's still different from the NWT because of the accusative difference, right? The NWT uses harpagmon as the direct object. But you could still use the being equal with God as the direct object, Not in the syntactical pattern that would be idiomatic like we've been reading, but you could still do it grammatically. Or actually, that would be the syntactical pattern we're talking about, right? So you're different from NWT is what I mean. So when you take it according to the syntactical pattern different from NWT, then the being equal with God is your direct object, and he either does or doesn't grasp or exploit it. Right? So if he's not exploiting it and it's an equality he already has, if you're a Trinitarian, you're going to view that in light of the creeds, right? Because no other text talks about the Trinity or persons of God sharing equally in the Godhead. Other texts talk about what we say. He's the imprint of God's being. That's why I interpret this text specifically in light of texts like Hebrews 1, because they're all talking about the same thing. The ones that talk about the pre-existent Son, John 1:2. John 1:1 as well, I mean. It's just not as explicit in terms of form of God, imprint of God's being. That's the same thing, I believe. Just different descriptions. Right? He's not something different in each case, right? When he's the one through whom all things are made in Hebrews 1. And when he's in the form of God in Philippians 2, those aren't different. They're both before he became a man. So they're the same. John 1:1 is the same. It's just not as described. The God he is there. It's the same as the Hebrews 1, Philippians 2, form of God, imprint of his being God. There's no difference. They're all the same form and appearance that he had as a God, as the firstborn Son of God. So there's definitely, in terms of like the imprint and having the same outline, different substance, there's definitely an equality or likeness, right? Consistent with the use of the term Isa. Either as an exact equality in terms of the outline, or as a likeness in terms of the outline being reflective of the ring. But being pretty exact. I mean, they're seen as the same thing, only different substance, one makes the other. That's the analogy we're given. Those are the terms, the descriptions. So when it talks about him having the form, the morphe of a God, or God, it doesn't mean something different than Hebrews 1, as the imprint of God's being. That's what he gave up. And is either considered an equality that he didn't exploit or cling to or grasp, according to the translations that we've reviewed. But it doesn't create a Trinitarian metaphysic to say that he existed as a God or in the form of a God or a God, right? He'd be in the form of God, just like Hebrews 1 states, outshining his glory, imprint of his being. He'd be in the form of a God, just like John 1:1 states, or John 10 states, as a Son of God. So there's definitely an equality of form or likeness of form that he could have chosen to or not to exploit. And in this case, didn't. He didn't use it to his own advantage, right? Instead, he what? He gave it up. Kanao. And took on another form. And that form is described here and in Hebrews 2. Lower than the angels. Not a God-man. These texts don't say that. No text says that in the Bible. Trinitarians say that in their creeds and councils and writings, and then they interpret the Bible in light of their creeds and councils and writings. The Bible says he was in the form of a God or God and didn't consider that equality with God as something to exploit or grasp, used to his own advantage. Instead, emptied himself of the very thing that he himself was just said to have had and been, form of God, and became a man. Exactly like Hebrews 1 and Hebrews 2 state. He was the imprint of God's being outshining of his glory, and then became lower than the angels, lower than Elohim, gods, in the Hebrew text of Psalm 8. Just like man, not a God man. That directly conflicts with the Trinity.